At 5:30 in the morning on July 16, 1979, an employee at the United Nuclear Corporation mill near Church Rock, New Mexico, noticed something wrong. A 20-foot gash had torn through the south embankment of the tailings dam. 94 million gallons of radioactive waste were already pouring into Pipeline Arroyo. The liquid was acidic enough to burn skin on contact. Its pH measured between 1.2 and 1.5, roughly the acidity of battery acid, and it was loaded with uranium, thorium, radium, and polonium. But here's what makes this moment chilling. This disaster released more radioactivity into the environment than 3 Mile Island. 46 curies of alpha emitters compared to 3 Mile Island's 13, yet most Americans have never heard of Church Rock. The timing was no coincidence. July 16, 1979 marked exactly 34 years since the Trinity nuclear test, the world's first atomic bomb detonation. That test also happened at 5:30 in the morning. On the same date, in the same state, but while Trinity made history, Church Rock was buried by it. Before we dive into how this became America's largest radioactive disaster, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. This story needs to be told. The spill didn't stay contained. Within hours, the contaminated slurry was flowing downstream through Pipeline Arroyo into the Puerco River. From there, it traveled 80 miles through Navajo Nation territory and into Arizona. The radioactive flood contaminated water supplies for at least 11 Navajo communities. 1,700 people lived along that contaminated stretch. The water measured 7,000 times above safe drinking limits for radioactivity. Livestock that waded into the acidic effluent suffered chemical burns. Residents reported their skin burning after contact with the water. Children who had played in these waters for generations were now warned to stay away entirely. Warning signs went up along the Rio Puerco. But for many Navajo families, this river wasn't just water, it was life. It watered their crops. It sustained their animals. It connected their communities across the high desert. And now, it was poison. The United Nuclear Corporation mill had been operating since June 1977. It used a process called cyanide leaching to extract uranium from old mine waste, the same method that would later fail catastrophically at Baia Mare in Romania. But the Church Rock facility had been showing warning signs for years. Cracks appeared in the dam as early as 1977. They were sealed with a bentonite and kerosene slurry, essentially plugging the cracks with clay and oil. More cracks appeared in October 1978. These were also sealed and ignored. The dam stood 35 feet high and held 3 separate tailings ponds. The south cell, the one that failed, was built on collapsible clayey silts and sands. The foundation was prone to settlement. Engineers knew this. They built it anyway. The tailings pond was unlined, allowing radioactive seepage to weaken the foundation from below. Liquid levels reportedly exceeded the design capacity by 2 feet. Every structural warning was dismissed or band-aided. When heavy rains hit that July, the saturated foundation finally gave way. Differential settlement, uneven sinking of the dam's base caused the catastrophic breach. It was entirely preventable, but prevention would have cost money. When United Nuclear Corporation first addressed the spill, they called it an act of God. Company officials insisted the dam met international standards. They claimed the extreme weather that hit the region was unforeseeable under normal conditions. The numbers told a different story. This wasn't an act of God. It was an act of negligence. The spill occurred just 4 months after 3 Mile Island had focused national attention on nuclear safety. But while 3 Mile Island dominated headlines for weeks, Church Rock barely registered in national media. The difference wasn't the scale of the disaster. Church Rock was objectively worse. The difference was location. 3 Mile Island threatened suburban Pennsylvania. Church Rock threatened rural Navajo Nation. New Mexico initially shut down the mill pending investigation, but by November, operations had resumed. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission suspended United Nuclear's license on October 12th, then reinstated it on November 2nd. 3 weeks. That's how long the largest radioactive spill in U.S. history kept a uranium mill offline. Meanwhile, downstream communities were left to deal with contaminated water, soil, and livestock. The Navajo Nation would eventually settle with United Nuclear for $525,000 in 1980, less than $6 per person affected. The cleanup crews scraped only the hotspots near the upper river miles. Downstream stagnant pools loaded with sulfuric acid persisted for weeks. Arizona and New Mexico agencies initially said there was no immediate danger. But immediate wasn't the problem. The problem was forever. Because what happened at Church Rock wasn't just about one dam failing on one morning in July. It was about a system that treated Navajo land as expendable, a system that prioritized profit over protection, a system that buried its worst disasters in bureaucratic language and regulatory capture. The Navajo Nation sits on some of the richest uranium deposits in North America. 4 million tons of ore had been mined from Navajo lands by 1979. The Government Accountability Office would later identify 523 abandoned uranium mines scattered across Navajo territory. Church Rock was just the beginning of a much larger story. A story about environmental racism, about nuclear colonialism, about what happens when the people who pay the price for America's energy don't have the power to refuse. And it was about to get much worse. By 6 in the morning, the United Nuclear employee who discovered the breach had managed to halt the discharge pumps. 2 hours later, crews erected a temporary dike to stop the residual flow. But 94 million gallons had already escaped. Along with 1,100 tons of solid tailings, the damage was done in 3 hours. The consequences would last decades. Within 24 hours, the radioactive plume had traveled over 100 kilometers downstream. The contamination reached nearly 100 miles into Arizona, farther than anyone had predicted. Water samples downstream measured gross alpha radiation at 128 nanocuries per liter. That's not just above safe limits. That's in a different universe from safe limits. The Centers for Disease Control selected 6 Navajo individuals for bioassay testing at Los Alamos National Laboratory. The results of those tests remain classified to this day. What were they looking for? What did they find? The silence itself tells a story. Visual. CDC officials in hazmat suits, Los Alamos facility, redacted documents. The Mine Safety and Health Administration launched an immediate investigation. Their report, issued July 23, 1979, was damning. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission commissioned their own technical failure analysis. Both reached the same conclusion. This disaster was entirely preventable. The dam had been built on collapsible clayey silts and sands, soil that engineers knew would settle unevenly under pressure. Differential settlement had been identified as the principal failure mechanism before construction even began. They built it anyway. The tailings pond was unlined. Radioactive seepage had been weakening the foundation from below since the facility opened. Liquid levels exceeded design capacity by 2 feet. Cracks had appeared repeatedly and been sealed with temporary fixes. Every warning sign had been documented and ignored. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was corporate negligence with radioactive consequences. But the technical failure was just the beginning. The real story was in the response, or the lack of one. When news of the spill first broke, Arizona and New Mexico agencies rushed to reassure the public. No immediate danger, they announced. Radiation levels returning to normal. Water safe for livestock in most areas. The word immediate was doing a lot of heavy lifting in those statements. Immediate danger wasn't the issue. The issue was uranium-238, which has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. The issue was thorium-230, which remains hazardous for tens of thousands of years. The issue was radium-226, which bioaccumulates in bones and teeth. No immediate danger was technically correct. It was also completely irrelevant. Congressional hearings were scheduled for October 22, 1979. The House subcommittee wanted answers. How had this happened? Who was responsible? How many more church rocks were waiting to fail? Witnesses would call the breach preventable. They would detail the engineering shortcuts, the regulatory capture, the systematic disregard for Navajo communities downstream. They would demand accountability. But accountability requires power, and power was exactly what Navajo communities lacked in the uranium economy that had been built on their land. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from today. And if this story hits you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. The Church Rock spill didn't happen in isolation. It was the predictable result of decades of uranium extraction that treated Navajo Nation as a national sacrifice zone. By 1979, 4 million tons of uranium ore had been mined from Navajo lands. Most of it had been shipped off to fuel America's nuclear weapons program and power plants. The profits left with the uranium. The contamination stayed behind. The Government Accountability Office would eventually identify 523 abandoned uranium mines scattered across Navajo territory. 523 sites where radioactive waste had been left behind when the mining companies moved on. No cleanup, no monitoring, no responsibility for the communities left to live with the consequences. Church Rock was just the latest addition to this toxic legacy. But it was different because it couldn't be hidden. When 94 million gallons of radioactive waste flow down a major river system, people notice. When livestock start dying and children can't play in the water, the damage becomes visible. For the first time, America's nuclear colonialism had consequences that couldn't be contained within reservation boundaries. The spill's timing, July 16th, carried its own dark symbolism. 34 years earlier to the day, the Trinity test had ushered in the atomic age at 5:30 in the morning in the New Mexico desert. Now, at the same time, on the same date, in the same state, America's nuclear legacy was literally spilling across the landscape. Trinity had been about harnessing the atom. Church Rock was about what happened when that power escaped control. But while Trinity made the history books, Church Rock was written off as an industrial accident. The difference wasn't scientific, it was political. Trinity served American power. Church Rock exposed its costs. The bioassay testing revealed something troubling. The 6 Navajo individuals selected by the CDC weren't random samples. They had been specifically chosen based on their exposure levels. But the results, what those tests found in their bodies, remain classified decades later. What kind of contamination requires 45 years of secrecy? Medical experts who studied the spill privately expressed concerns about long-term cancer risks, genetic damage, and reproductive health impacts. But public statements remained carefully neutral. More research needed. Long-term monitoring recommended. No immediate health threats identified. The gap between private concern and public reassurance was becoming a pattern. United Nuclear Corporation settled civil claims with the Navajo Nation for $525,000 in 1980 for the largest radioactive spill in U.S. history, for contaminating 80 miles of river, for exposing 1,700 people to dangerous radiation levels, $525,000, less than the cost of a single suburban home in 1980, less than $6 per person affected. That settlement wasn't compensation. It was insult added to radioactive injury. Meanwhile, cleanup efforts focused on the most visible contamination near the spill site. Hotspots were scraped and removed from the upper river miles. But downstream, stagnant pools loaded with sulfuric acid persisted for weeks. The contaminated sediment that had settled along 80 miles of riverbed was left largely undisturbed. Cleaning up the optics was cheaper than cleaning up the contamination. New Mexico initially closed the mill pending investigation. The shutdown lasted exactly 3 weeks. By November 2nd, 1979, United Nuclear Corporation was back in operation. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission had suspended their license on October 12th and reinstated it 21 days later. 3 weeks to investigate the largest radioactive spill in American history. 3 weeks to ensure it wouldn't happen again. 3 weeks to restore public confidence in nuclear safety. But confidence, like contamination, doesn't respect official timelines. The real question wasn't how Church Rock happened. The technical failure was straightforward. Predictable engineering shortcuts on unstable ground with inadequate oversight. The real question was why it was allowed to happen, and that question led to uncomfortable truths about environmental racism, corporate capture of regulatory agencies, and the systematic sacrifice of indigenous communities for American energy needs. Church Rock wasn't an accident. It was an inevitability. And until the underlying system changed, it was going to happen again. The investigations revealed something more disturbing than engineering failure. They revealed a system designed to fail safely for everyone except the people living downstream. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's technical report, completed in 1980, documented every warning sign that had been ignored. Cracks sealed with bentonite and kerosene. Foundation settling documented but dismissed. Liquid levels exceeding capacity. Drainage systems that never worked properly. But the most damning finding wasn't technical. It was institutional. The regulatory framework that was supposed to prevent disasters like Church Rock had been captured by the industry it was meant to oversee. United Nuclear Corporation operated with minimal independent oversight. Periodic inspections were conducted by local authorities who lacked both expertise and enforcement power. There was a systematic disconnect between technical reports and regulatory action. Engineers documented problems, bureaucrats filed reports. Companies continued operating. Communities paid the price. The Mines Safety and Health Administration found that differential settlement, the uneven sinking that caused the dam failure, had been identified as the principal risk before construction began. The International Atomic Energy Agency would later classify this as a textbook case of predictable structural failure. They built the dam anyway, on unsuitable soil, with inadequate drainage, using construction methods known to be vulnerable to exactly the conditions that caused the collapse. This wasn't incompetence. This was calculated risk taken with other people's lives. The environmental monitoring that followed revealed the true scope of the disaster. New Mexico's Environmental Improvement Division collected over 1,200 soil samples in the months after the spill. They found uranium, thorium-230, radium-226, and polonium contamination spread across an 80-mile river corridor. But they also found something else: cadmium, nickel, molybdenum, selenium, and lead. The spill hadn't just released radioactive materials. It had mobilized decades of accumulated heavy metals from uranium processing. The contamination was more complex, more persistent, and more dangerous than anyone had initially admitted. The Navajo communities downstream became unwilling subjects in a long-term study of radiation exposure. Medical researchers arrived with clipboards and consent forms. They wanted to document the health impacts. They wanted to publish papers about cancer clusters and genetic damage, but they didn't want to clean up the contamination that was causing the problems they were studying. Research without remediation became another form of exploitation. Navajo families found themselves treated as data points in academic studies while their children couldn't safely play in the water. The Church Rock site was proposed for the National Priorities List on December 30th, 1982. It was finalized as a Superfund site on September 8th, 1983. The Environmental Protection Agency selected a cleanup remedy on September 30th, 1988. 9 years to decide how to clean up the largest radioactive spill in US history. Construction was completed on September 29th, 1998. 19 years after the spill, an entire generation of Navajo children had grown up with contaminated water, while bureaucrats debated cleanup standards. But cleanup was a relative term. The remedy focused on containing the most visible contamination at the spill site itself, the 80 miles of downstream contamination. The sediment that had settled into riverbed and floodplain remained largely untouched. Containment, not cleanup. Control the optics, not the contamination. The most recent 5-year review was completed on September 29, 2023. 44 years after the spill, the EPA was still conducting reviews to determine if the cleanup was working. That's not cleanup. That's management of perpetual contamination. Meanwhile, the broader pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Church Rock wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic extraction economy built on Navajo land and Navajo sacrifice. The Government Accountability Office documented 4 million tons of uranium ore mined from Navajo Nation by 1979. 523 abandoned uranium mines dotted the landscape. 46 of those mines were later prioritized for elevated risk because they sat near homes or water sources. Each mine represented a community that had been promised jobs and prosperity in exchange for their land and health. Each abandonment represented a community left to deal with radioactive waste while the profits moved elsewhere. In 2005, the Navajo Nation passed the DNA Natural Resources Protection Act, banning all uranium mining on tribal land. The ban was confirmed the next day with a follow-up press release. No ambiguity, no exceptions, no more uranium extraction. But the ban came 30 years too late. The contamination was already in the ground, in the water, in the bodies of people who had lived with the consequences of America's nuclear economy. The Environmental Protection Agency and the Navajo Nation Environmental Protection Agency continue long-term monitoring across the 523 abandoned mine sites. They conduct 5-year reviews, they publish progress reports, they secure funding for risk reduction. Over $1.7 billion has been allocated for abandoned uranium mine cleanup. The 2015 Tronox bankruptcy yielded $950 million specifically for Navajo cleanup efforts. In 2025, a Department of Justice consent decree required United Nuclear Corporation and General Electric to remove 1 million cubic yards of contaminated waste. But money can't undo what's already been done. You can't unexpose a generation of children to radiation. You can't restore traditional ways of life built around water sources that are no longer safe. You can't rebuild trust between communities and institutions that prioritize profit over protection. Some contamination lasts longer than civilizations. Uranium-238 has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. That's longer than Earth has had complex life. That's longer than our sun will exist. The question isn't whether Church Rock will be cleaned up. The question is whether humanity will survive long enough to see uranium decay to safe levels naturally. And that brings us to the most unsettling truth about Church Rock. It's still happening. Not the spill itself, but the system that made it inevitable. Environmental racism didn't end with Church Rock. Corporate capture of regulatory agencies didn't end with Church Rock. The systematic sacrifice of indigenous communities for American energy needs didn't end with Church Rock. The only thing that ended was plausible deniability. 45 years after the Church Rock spill, children are still being born with elevated uranium levels in their bodies. Groundwater studies conducted by the United States Geological Survey found uranium contamination beneath the Puerco River that will persist for generations. Some reports now rank Church Rock as the third largest radioactive disaster in world history, after Chernobyl and Fukushima. But unlike those disasters, Church Rock remains largely unknown outside the communities that live with its consequences daily. The silence wasn't accidental, it was strategic. 3 Mile Island received wall-to-wall coverage because it threatened to disrupt American nuclear policy. Church Rock was buried because acknowledging its scale would have demanded a reckoning with environmental racism that America wasn't prepared to have. The media coverage tells the story. 3 Mile Island generated thousands of news articles, congressional hearings, and regulatory reforms. Church Rock generated a few regional news stories and bureaucratic reviews. The difference wasn't the magnitude of the disaster. The difference was who had the power to demand attention. Today, over 50% of households in some areas of Navajo Nation still rely on unregulated wells for drinking water. Wells that may be contaminated with uranium, arsenic, and other heavy metals from decades of mining activity. Wells that aren't tested because testing costs money and cleanup costs more. The Environmental Protection Agency continues to identify new contaminated sites. The most recent surveys document 86 mines in the eastern abandoned uranium mine region alone. Each site represents families who wake up every day wondering if their water is safe, if their children are being exposed, if the government agencies promising protection will ever deliver. The Department of Justice consent decree signed in 2025 requires United Nuclear Corporation and General Electric to remove 1 million cubic yards of contaminated waste from Church Rock. 1 million cubic yards. That's enough contaminated soil to bury a football field under a mountain 600 feet high, and that's just from one spill, from one facility, from one moment on one July morning in 1979. Multiply that by 523 abandoned mine sites across Navajo Nation. Multiply that by decades of extraction with minimal oversight. Multiply that by a regulatory system that treated indigenous land as sacrifice zones for American energy security. The bitter irony is inescapable. The uranium extracted from Navajo land powered the nuclear weapons that were supposed to protect America during the Cold War. The radioactive waste from that extraction poisoned the water, soil, and bodies of American citizens. National security built on the systematic poisoning of Americans. Protection achieved through the sacrifice of the people being protected. The contradiction was sustainable only as long as the victims remained invisible. Church Rock exposed that contradiction. For the first time, America's nuclear colonialism had consequences that couldn't be contained within reservation boundaries. The contamination flowed across state lines. The health impacts affected entire river systems. The cover-up became impossible when the evidence was flowing downstream at 94 million gallons. But exposure didn't lead to accountability. It led to more sophisticated concealment. The technical language got more precise. The monitoring got more extensive. The reviews got more frequent. But the fundamental relationship profits privatized. Contamination socialized remained unchanged. Some reports suggest that Church Rock's health impacts are still emerging. Cancer clusters that appeared decades after exposure. Genetic damage passed to children who weren't born when the spill occurred. Autoimmune disorders that may be linked to chronic low-level radiation exposure. But proving causation requires longitudinal studies that cost millions and take decades to complete. By the time the science is definitive, the people who made the decisions that caused the contamination are retired or dead. The companies have been sold or dissolved. The liability has been dispersed across corporate shells and government agencies. Justice delayed becomes justice denied. The cleanup continues, but it's cleanup of a very specific kind. Containment rather than removal. Management rather than restoration. The goal isn't to return the land to its original condition. The goal is to reduce contamination to acceptable levels, as defined by agencies that weren't drinking the water or breathing the dust. Acceptable to whom? Acceptable compared to what? Acceptable for how long? These questions don't have comfortable answers. Today, the Church Rock site operates under a 5-year review cycle. Every 5 years, federal agencies assess whether the containment is working, whether the monitoring is adequate, whether additional measures are needed. 5-year reviews for contamination that will remain dangerous for 4.5 billion years. That's like checking on a fire every 5 minutes while it burns down a continent. The mathematics of institutional responsibility don't scale to geological time. And this brings us to the most troubling aspect of the Church Rock story. It's not history, it's precedent. The regulatory capture that allowed Church Rock is still operating. The environmental racism that targeted Navajo communities for sacrifice is still embedded in how America makes decisions about energy infrastructure. The corporate structures that privatize profits and socialize risks haven't been reformed, they've been perfected. Every pipeline proposal through indigenous territory, every waste storage facility sited in low-income communities, every regulatory agency captured by the industry it's supposed to oversee, every cost-benefit analysis that discounts the health of people who lack political power. Church Rock didn't end these patterns. It revealed them. The question isn't whether there will be another Church Rock. The question is whether we'll recognize it when it happens. Whether we'll acknowledge the systematic nature of environmental racism. Whether we'll demand accountability before the damage is done rather than managing it afterward. Because containment isn't cleanup, monitoring isn't justice, and accepting contamination as the price of energy isn't a sustainable basis for civilization. 45 years after the largest radioactive spill in American history, uranium levels in some Navajo communities still exceed safe drinking water standards. Children still can't safely play in streams their grandparents once fished. Families still choose between expensive bottled water and potentially contaminated wells. The spill lasted 3 hours. The consequences will outlast our species. If this story changes how you think about environmental justice, if it makes you question whose health gets sacrificed for whose energy needs, then make sure you're subscribed. Because this isn't the only disaster that's been buried in bureaucratic language and regulatory capture. There are more stories that need telling, more communities that deserve attention, more disasters that powerful interests would prefer to keep quiet. The next Church Rock is being planned right now. The only question is whether we'll stop it before it starts, or whether we'll spend the next 45 years managing the contamination while pretending it was inevitable. Church Rock wasn't an accident, it was a choice. And every day we allow the same systems to operate with the same incentives, we're making that choice again. The uranium will outlast us all. The only question is what kind of world we'll leave behind.